Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 10th of January 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Apologies for the slight delay, a little bit of a technical hitch, but we're here with UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, with me in the studio, Mike Robinson, and we're delighted to say that we've got Mark Anderson from American Free Press, who'll be with us on live Skype link. So in view of the slight delay, we'll get straight on with the news. And of course, weather is critical.
Well, it is. And I just wanted to highlight this stupid coverage in all the mainstream press on the snow, which is likely to hit the UK later in the week as an Arctic blast comes in from Canada. But it's not ordinary snow, Brian. It's thunder snow.
Okay.
So what do you say about that?
Could you tell me more about the thunder snow?
Well, it's just snow.
Right.
So you know, it's snow. What can you say?
It's snow.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on very quickly. Commonwealth Development Corporation Bill 2016-2017. This is at the report stage today. Now, many people may not have heard of the Commonwealth Development Corporation. It's now called CDC Group PLC. We'll explain why in a second. Formerly the Commonwealth Development Corporation, and before that it was a Colonial Development Corporation, and it's a development finance institution. It's basically money being pumped into up-and-coming economies in Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. And it's run by the Department for International Development. So, as we like to do, we'll put Priti Patel up because, of course, she's International Development Secretary. And she's saying the new CDC bill will raise the limit on financial support that the government can provide to the Commonwealth Development Corporation. So, here's the CDC website. We invest in business, they say, in some of the world's poorest places. It was originally established in 1948, as I say, as the Colonial Development Corporation by the British government. It's wholly owned by the British government. There was a Commonwealth Development Corporation Act of 1999 when it was converted from a statutory corporation to a public limited company. So it is a PLC. All the shares are currently owned by the UK government. And then, as you would expect, as time went on, things started to get spun off into private enterprises. So in July 2004, it spun out a private equity fund manager called Actis Capital. And that was a 60% stake sold to the management team. They're doing this with other things presently. Things like the Behavioural Insights team have been spun out in similar ways from other departments. Now, Private Eye have had a go at them in the past. In 2010, they were pretty much highlighting the fact that instead of beneficial international development for the countries involved, it's all about profit and ripping off the countries involved. And then up until 2012, CDC, of course, up until 2012 didn't make any direct investments on their own. They relied on investment companies to do that, so they funneled money through other companies. But since 2012, CDC is investing directly in businesses. But the Commonwealth Development Corporation Act 1999 put a limit on the amount that could be invested from government of £1.5 billion. And this new act is going to up that limit to £6 billion with further provisions which will allow, without them going back to Parliament for more primary legislation, will allow them to increase that to £12 billion. And who all's involved in this? We've got other so-called finance institutions, development finance institutions like EFDI, which is the European, an association of 16 European finance institutions, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We've got organisations like the African Venture Capital Association, the British Venture Capital Association, the Business Action for Africa, Chatham House, of course, are everywhere. Emerging Markets Private Equity Association, Global Impact Investing Network, Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, Institutional Limited Partners Association, Overseas Development Institute, Royal African Society, the list goes on. So what's that all about?
Well, I think it's very encouraging, Mike, that we've got Britain, which at the moment, of course, is performing exceptionally well as a country. We've only got to look at schools or the roads or the NHS or the state of the military. We're doing everything extremely well. We're going to export all that expertise to the Commonwealth. And we haven't got any money in this country, but all of a sudden we've got, what is it, up to 12 billion to use overseas. So that's been magicked up. What are we unleashing? I think we're unleashing something extremely unpleasant on these poor countries, and they're not going to be able to deal with the political agenda that's being brought in.
Absolutely.
I'll just add to that, sorry if I may, that somebody, while you were running through that, mentioned Red Cross parcels and said, well, we're going to be taking Red Cross parcels here in UK fairly shortly. Well, in a couple of moments, we're going to be moving on to the NHS, where the Red Cross is already having to act.
Indeed. But what we'll just say about this, of course, that 12 billion, up to 12 billion pounds, which the new act, if it goes through, would permit, is government investment. They're also funneling private investment as well. And what is this about? Well, of course, it is about the hashtag Global Britain policy, the new post-Brexit Global Britain policy, where we push so-called soft power out to every corner of the planet. It's a resurgence of the empire.
Yeah. Can I suggest, and no doubt Mark will comment in due course, but we've got the British soft power backed up by the American military power.
Absolutely.
Seems to be the game.
Yes. Yes, and I just want to bring this back on screen again. If you haven't read this article yet from Martin Edwards, we're all in this together, please do read it, and most importantly, please do share it, because if you want to understand how British soft power works, this article sums it up very well. You know, what we're talking about here is the Common Purpose Network, but in amongst the Common Purpose Network, of course, is government, Theresa May, and her lackeys, also the Bank of England. And so this is one of the tentacles of soft power highlighted by this article. Well, let's look at another one, because the Club of Madrid was pushing this out on Twitter this morning. It's a photograph of, a group of young African people.
Leaders, I would gather.
Absolutely, leaders. And also in there is the recently deceased James Mencham, who is the ex-president of the Seychelles. They're absolutely crowing about this. Africa Venture, which is yet another one of the common purpose tentacles in Africa. Africa Venture is an annual Pan-African leadership program, they say, which assembles exceptional emerging leaders from government, businesses and non-profits across Africa, including North, South, East, West and Central Africa. And the program enables the transfer of knowledge, know-how and inspiration across the generations, involving some of the most inspiring leaders in the world today. It creates a new generation of African leaders who have the cultural intelligence to work fluidly and flexibly across the continent, who have the analytical and creative skills to use diversity to spark innovation, and who have extraordinarily broad African networks.
I'm not feeling too well at this point, Mike, because this is pure reframing of selected individuals to form these future leaders. So they're not going to be thinking normally.
Absolutely. Now, what else do they say? Well, they say that it's a think tank of senior leaders from across the continent who set a challenge for the group, which provides the framework for the program. Participants will explore the challenge from every possible angle and will see both the problems and the possible solutions, and they'll work up practical ideas in response to the challenge. I mean, this is an absolute controlling of future leadership on the continent and pushing out policy, yeah. Well,
it's worldwide, so the policy is mimicked. It doesn't matter which country it is, and that's why they had to get, for example, common purpose into Libya so quickly to make sure that Libya couldn't rebuild itself. It had to be rebuilt with the assistance of common purpose, funded by the EU, I might add, on that occasion.
Okay, so let's end this little section with another government report. And once again, we see the common purpose purple, because we are experiencing the purple revolution at the moment, and purple is everywhere at the moment. We'll see that later too. This is reconnecting with the Commonwealth, the UK's free trade opportunities. Again, this is the new post-Brexit policy to start, because TPP, TTIP, and so on have more or less failed as policies. So we're going for the smaller bites at the cherry, the same cherry, mind you, we're just taking smaller bites and reconnecting with the Commonwealth. And this report really highlighting how the Commonwealth represents such a fantastic opportunity for British business and British trade, and that really we shouldn't worry too much about Europe. We should just go ahead with making trade agreements with Commonwealth countries. And they say that, of course, as the world's second largest service economy, the UK should also join in the Trade in Service Agreement initiated by the US and Australia. So, Mark, quite a lot there. What are your thoughts on what we've just covered?
I think Brian hit on it the best, that these countries aren't allowed to have a grassroots approach to develop themselves. I hope I'm coming through clearly here. I know we had a few technical glitches, but Francois de Siebenthal, a former Swiss banker who I know very well, has shown through rice banks and through an application, a variation of social credit economics, among other approaches, has shown in Madagascar and Africa that you can develop third world countries without all this outside investment by teaching people to develop their own economy from the ground up. It's been done through Catholic missionary work, it's been done through other means, but this approach by the globalists, by common purpose and whatnot, while it might have a few peripheral benefits here and there, is largely not what these African and other third world nations need. So there are other approaches that are not being done here.
Well, that's absolutely right, and of course, what we're witnessing is the continuing efforts to make sure that these countries can't develop. And I mean, a perfect example of it was a couple of years ago on the BBC. They ran a sort of a series of programs called "Swimming with Crocodiles," and at the end of the series, they were describing how crocodiles were posing a danger for people collecting water at the riverside. And so the BBC solution to this was to put up some signs saying "Danger, crocodiles," as if the people that had been living there for thousands of years didn't know that there were crocodiles in the river, when in fact what these people probably needed was a tap.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah. So what's next?
Well, let's come back to UK and have a look at the state of the country. So no better place to go than the NHS. Here's the report in from the Plymouth Local Herald. It says Red Cross volunteers drafted into Derriford Hospital to ease NHS pressure. So this is the reality. We've now got the Red Cross having to come in and help the NHS. And if we follow this story, of course, this isn't just about Derriford Hospital in Plymouth. We're talking about the whole NHS. But we'll just take a couple of points here. It says Derriford, like many other trusts across the UK, declared itself on the highest possible alert level last week. And that is basically saying that the hospital was close to meltdown because they simply couldn't cope with A&E and other operations going on. But 24 hours later, it was reduced to an Operation Pressures Escalation Level 3 rating. Thanks to a fantastic response from the staff. Now, we know how hard the staff have been working at Derriford because we talk to them and we get information from them. But what we're interested in here is what is going on in the NHS, which is creating this problem. But of course, there isn't a problem because Jeremy Hunt said that hospitals are performing slightly better than this time last year. And he defended the NHS against claims of a humanitarian crisis, which is what the Red Cross is saying is going on. And Theresa May, for those of you who don't know, she is apparently the British Prime Minister, but she's been very quiet of late. She says there isn't a crisis at all. So we've got a remarkable situation that there's report after report across the country. In the Midlands, we know that hospitals have had to actually stop all operations because the hospital is at breakdown point. But apparently there's no problem. Now, in that article, we're interested to see this gentleman got a mention. Let's bring him up on screen. So this is an organisation called NHS Providers. They actually train and boast that they train most of the NHS trusts and their executive directors. But the chief executive of NHS Providers rejected the idea that there was a crisis and did not think it was an appropriate description. Now, that was the quote from the Plymouth Herald. We decided to phone the organisation themselves and ask whether their chief executive stood by that statement that there wasn't a crisis. Well, we received a very interesting and very hostile reply because we were told that the problem was the word humanitarian. Humanitarian crisis means quote, something equating to what has been going on in Syria. Clearly, that isn't going on in the NHS. So it isn't really a humanitarian crisis. People are dying. It's nothing to do with humanity. In fact, it's not really a crisis at all. So let's have a look at this organisation. Encourage people to go to the site. It's a membership organisation and trade association for the NHS Acute Ambulance Community and Mental Health Services.
Because that's what the NHS is, not a trade.
A trade, business.
Yeah,
very close to. And it says, we help those foundation trusts and other trusts to deliver high quality patient-focused care by enabling them to learn from each other, acting as their public voice and helping shape the system. So one failing hospital is going to learn from another, but we are there, it says, to influence governance and policy within the NHS. So an organisation, very interesting organisation, linking together all of these NHS trusts, which are having major problems, failing, people dying, people being left on trolleys, people not having fluids and being fed. But not to worry, because these organisations are teaching one another and having to bring in the Red Cross, but it's not a crisis, Mike.
No.
I'd like to stress that. So who was the gentleman we spoke to? Well, let's bring him on screen because he was a bit worried as to whether the conversation was off the record, but when I speak, it's on the record, so I don't see why we should have special rules. His name's Adam Brimlow. I asked him whether he was aware of the extent of what was going on in the NHS, and I mentioned Staffordshire Hospital, and he replied that basically he'd been a former BBC reporter and reported on Staffordshire Hospital when I said that Staffordshire was one of a minimum of 10 or 11 equally bad hospitals. He didn't really want to talk to me for much longer. But this is his Twitter page. And if you go and have a look, there's a couple of interesting articles, one of which, of course, is he's plugging the BBC's interview by his own chief executive about what's going on in the NHS. So nice little bit of circular reporting there from the BBC health correspondent back through this organisation, which says, well, of course, it's not as bad as Syria, so there's no problem. Now, just to emphasise the logic these people use, this is obviously part of their website. Have a look at it. They're all about performance, and this is a press statement they released in relation to what's been going on in the NHS. And it says, the last few days have seen a wave of media coverage on current NHS accident and emergency department performance and how well the NHS is coping with the pressures. Much of the comment and media coverage seeks to extrapolate what this current performance means for the wider state of the NHS. What a terrible thing to do. People are saying if it's happening in one hospital, is it happening in another? But not to worry, because NHS providers said it's important to calibrate how well the NHS is doing as accurately as possible. We know this can be difficult when comments reported in the media are simplistic and binary. So we've got people in corridors on stretchers. We've got people dying, a minimum of 1,000 last year. I will say that's a gross understatement. But this training organisation helping to put this thing together says, well, it's not a problem. And if I just add this on screen here, here's the chief executive concerned. He says there's no humanitarian crisis and we should avoid exaggerating the scale of the problem so we don't frighten patients, undermine public confidence in the NHS or undervalue the staff. And he's fully supported by our very own Jeremy Hunt, Secretary of State for Health. And as we said yesterday, of course, what he is doing is driving the Tory plan to destroy the NHS from within, get rid of those nasty bed blockers, and introduce private healthcare for profit. And if you don't believe that, you might like to visit his Twitter page because he's very excited that there's now a new ambulance scheme to take end-of-life patients to the preferred place they'd like to go to die. So we're not really interested in a crisis which is killing people, but Jeremy Hunt has got very interested that terminally ill people can be transported to the place they want to go to die.
Now, if we link this with the story yesterday on the privatisation of crematoria and cemetery services,
we've got a nice little circle.
And of course, why is that happening? I mean, you've been hearing, been told that undertakers are refusing to do the job anymore.
Well, this is absolutely true. We've had a number of reports from undertakers. This is a very unpleasant subject, but what they are becoming deeply concerned about is the number of grossly underweight bodies. So they are now dealing with bodies of individuals that have clearly been severely dehydrated and are malnourished to the extent that they are extremely small. Their frame is extremely small. And this has also raised questions from relatives who are surprised at the size of the coffins. Nasty subject, but this is reality. And I'm just going to add to that, if we want to know what has been going on inside the NHS, then let's introduce this UK column article, More Powerful Than Ever, as we start to really understand what's happening. And this was Martin Edwards explaining in great detail how the charity Common Purpose has been at work inside the NHS. And he starts off with this quote, "For change to work, the discontent with the present must be greater than the tolerance of it." A quote from Robert Rowland Smith, philosopher. And the purpose of this quote is that if you analyse what's happening, huge turbulence, bullying, stress, anxiety being put on the staff in hospitals, create the failure, and then you can create the privatised system.
Mark, are hospitals in the States suffering from this degree of systemic breakdown?
Yes, in a slightly different way, but of course we have a much more privatized system to begin with. But I would comment that just like these African and Madagascar, where I talked about the rice banks, and third world countries, just like they need a grassroots application of economics and not this importation, of this investment class and Chatham House and all that. Just like they need grassroots help there in those third world countries, healthcare is also something that doesn't work very well in a purely profit-driven system. It has to be something that comes from the real soil and grassroots of a country. And the same thing is true of money and the creation of money and the basic infrastructure of an economy, the currency, kind of like with the Bradbury pound and so on. What we're seeing here are things that just don't work well under these purely profit-driven systems. Healthcare is one, money's another, and another is the basic development of a nation. And so, we've all been schooled to think that capitalism and for-profit is the only way to go across the board, and it's just not true. But yes, in the U.S., we have maybe not people dying on stretchers in hallways and whatnot, but what we do have is a monopoly such as chemotherapy, radiation, and other treatments that largely kill people more than the disease itself, and a very, very a stubborn system that is not open to change and not open to alternative treatments. So you have people dying here from the treatments more than the disease. And cancer is a good example. You're more likely to die from chemo or radiation than you are from the cancer.
Yeah.
Sad state of affairs. We'll be reporting more on the NHS in the coming weeks.
Okay, children. Now, Tim Farron, the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, still has not given any satisfactory answer to the issue of missing refugee children in this country. and we get an opportunity to discuss this with him perhaps. And so I'd like to suggest that everybody gets on the phone because he will be taking questions on LBC at 6 p.m. tonight. And perhaps might be nice to see LBC switchboard absolutely inundated with questions about what Tim Farron is going to do about missing children from the British care system.
And of course, people can particularly quote I think the number was 324 missing Syrian children, because Fallon's reply to our email on that subject was yes, he accepted that many of them would have been trafficked or prostituted or used in some way, but he simply didn't then say what he was going to do about it. So you can specifically quote the missing Syrian children, which have been reported in a number of newspapers to date.
So that's 6 p.m. tonight on LBC. Now, just before we came on air, haven't seen too much detail about this yet, but Brian Altman QC was named as the new lead counsel in the sexual abuse inquiry by Professor Alexis Jay, who's the head of the inquiry. So I just thought I'd put his webpage up just to show you what he looks like. It says here that he was called to the bar by the Middle Temple in 1981 after studying law at King's College London and European law at the University of Amsterdam, and completing the Inns of Court School of Law Bar vocational course. And he soon proved himself, he says in his own words, an exceptional barrister. In 1997, he was appointed Treasury Counsel, standing counsel to the Crown at the Central Criminal Court, where he rose to become Senior Treasury Counsel and then First Senior Treasury Counsel. He delivers apparently remarkable results. This, combined with his ability to understand complex financial and IT data, makes him an ideal choice for businesses and high net worth individuals seeking a barrister for major corporate fraud, bribery and corruption cases. So perhaps he is the right person for the job, Brian.
Doesn't seem to have a lot of experience with abuse issues or children.
No.
But very interesting colours on that website. I did pick up the glow of common purpose purple and green, but it was probably my imagination.
Yeah. And another report from the House of Commons this time on children's mental health. And this follows on from Theresa May's big, what's it called? Society. Well, anyway.
Fairer Society.
Yes, the Fairness Society that's coming. Apparently 1 in 4 people on average experience a mental health problem, with the majority of these beginning in childhood. And they're saying that a previous report by the Chief Medical Officer in 2014 found that 50% of adult mental health problems start before the age of 15 and 75% before the age of 18. And so they were launching this new report to try to keep the pressure on to make sure that Theresa May actually spend some money on mental health provision, whereas in fact, I believe what she's going to be spending the money on is something quite different.
Something quite different, and we'll just pop this one in because, of course, it's relevant. Article from the Mail. This gentleman's accused of quite a lot. I think it's 35 offences, sexual offences against boys at George Osborne's old secondary school. So this is a major article on this man and his grooming. Sorry, it's 24 counts of indecent assault and 1 count of gross indecency. So that was 25. Apologies, not 35, 25. Now, this case is just reported as starting, but I've added the headline here. Of course, there is no abuse in Westminster, according to Theresa May and the Conservative government. There's abuse everywhere else, but none of it is around Westminster. Certainly none of it involves MPs, and none of it involves members of the establishment or indeed higher levels of the police force, despite the fact that the Met's own whistleblowers have been saying that that is simply not the case. So covering it up.
Yes.
We could leap into the same subject in the States, but we'll just introduce this, which will bring Mark in with us nicely. The Guardian here, Mark, has been reporting that the US has added a couple of gentlemen onto the sort of hit list, the sanctions list, and it says that Obama is doing this in the last few days to get back at the Russians. I apologies, I can't actually read the names from here, but the point is that we've got another 2 that supposedly were involved in the Litvinenko affair that have now been put on the banned list. So it seems that tension's still running quite high with Obama and those nasty Russians.
Oh, certainly so. As you probably reported, Obama deported, that is, he sent out of the country 35 Russian diplomats and also affected some other Russian based operations, rather obscure sounding, that are operating in the US. Of course, this cuts across the whole fake news narrative that's enveloping us all. Uh, Anybody that doesn't quote the CBC in Canada or the BBC in England or the CNN or other alphabet soup nations in the United States, if you don't rely on them for your news, then therefore you must be stepping outside the Anglo-Saxon Empire, and therefore you must be quoting Russian news, therefore you must be in league with Russia, therefore you're an ally and you have a beer every Sunday with Putin, and that you're an enemy of the West. And so, this is bouncing all over the globe now, but alternative media such as ours is gaining ground, and the establishment media, which is a direct ally, in my opinion, of the establishment governments, is really running scared. And these sorts of stories are just bouncing all over the place. I don't know if there's time or the wherewithal to get into the details a lot right now. I've written a lot about it on my blog, thetruthhound.com, and there's a number of items there that people can read about fake news, even fake economists. Economists are next on the list after establishment media reporters in terms of peddling very limited narratives, very deceptive narratives that keep us trapped in a kind of informational prison where we can't, get out and see the larger truths. But that's changing with the alternative press, with alternative views on economics and currency and things like that. And so, yeah, it's a very perilous time we live in, but also a very promising one in a lot of ways, as you guys are well aware.
Right. Well, Mark, from your website, thetruthhound.com, let's just go through a couple of these, because you have a headline here: "Oops, hollow claims of Russian hacking reveal US elections can be stolen after all." Now, of course, you're not saying they have been, but really you're highlighting once again the fact that the reliance on electronic voting machines.
Yeah, this is the issue that few have seemed to catch on to. Amid all this discussion about the Podesta Clinton emails, all this discussion about the DNC hacking that supposedly was done by Russia and supposedly passed on to WikiLeaks, which then dropped this information bomb on what I call America's tender democracy, which cannot take any, even 5 or 10 mile an hour winds will send our democracy careening across the countryside, out of control, damaged beyond repair. But what, in fact, we're seeing here is the establishment is shooting themselves in the foot. By saying that Putin did all this hacking, they're admitting that our electronic computer-based election systems are vulnerable. American Free Press and me as a writer, and you guys have been saying this all along for years, that computerized voting is one place where computers shouldn't be so predominant in the first place. We should probably be voting with paper ballots, hand counted in the open.
Hold on, Mark. Just before we get on to that, because we'll talk about that in a second, let's just bring this one up. So tell us about the Presley lawsuit.
Well, Laura Presley is an activist and a former Austin City Council candidate in Austin, Texas, and she just had her Texas State Third Court of Appeals lawsuit completely defeated. What she was trying to do was she had tons of documentation. She showed me the documentation herself. This is shown on a video at livestream.com/Ron Avery, Arvery, excuse me, Ron Avery, Abery. And in this video interview that she gave me, she points out with tons of documentation that she presented to the Texas governor and all the key Texas election officials. She points out that Texas election officials have not been following the law. They have not been adhering to the best practices that ensure honest and accountable elections. She brought this forward in the form of a lawsuit. the Third Court of Appeals completely trounced her lawsuit. They ruled against her just very recently. This is breaking news. She had the best documentation and the best approach I've seen. And had these laws been followed, had the court done the right thing, Texas could have made a quantum leap in making sure that all the laws are properly followed, even with electronic voting. But the Texas state officials wouldn't even do that, let alone get rid of the unaccountable electronic computerized voting that we know is not the way to go. So it's a very big setback, but Laura was really trying to do the right thing. But unfortunately, it didn't work out at this point.
So has the United States become a banana republic?
Well, it's so heavily dependent on for-profit systems like it is with healthcare, so too with elections. Now we have private companies like ES&S in Omaha and Hart InterCivic and others selling voting machines to 95% of our precincts, these for-profit companies that have proprietary software that can be hacked. So if we're so worried about Russian hacking or any other sources of hacking, why do we use these hackable machines that can steal elections? And as I put in here, and I think you're beginning to show it on your screen now, the solution is push for paper ballots, negate hacking, and keep the Federal Department of Homeland Security out of our elections, thereby avoiding the nationalization of our elections. This can all be done by going back to a more grassroots paper ballot system. It solves the whole problem. But of course, as you guys know, in the UK, as is true in the US, they want to create problems so they can bring forth their own solutions rather than have real solutions and stop the problems for real.
Of course, paper ballots are still open to some kind of hacking, as we have witnessed ourselves, but it has to be a much larger operation. It's much more difficult to do, whereas hacking electronic systems a lot easier. Look, let's move on, Marcus. We're running out of time. Now, you recently, I think a week or so ago, spoke to G. Edward Griffin.
Yeah, this was a follow-up, kind of a wrap-up to the Global Warming and Inconvenient Lie conference that he put on in early December that I covered. We already reported that on here. I won't repeat that. But Mr. Griffin, who put on that Freedom Force International conference, was too busy at the conference to talk to. So I did a follow-up podcast, an audio interview with an accompanying article. People can read and listen to that at AmericanFreePress.net. But it's a nice wrap up, and he provides some wisdom also on the Federal Reserve System that he wrote about in his famous book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. And he also, besides global warming, gets into some very useful and factual analogies of just what the Fed is. It's a cartel. Therefore, what the U.S. would fundamentally have to do to get rid of the Fed. He doesn't talk about the replacement of it so much, which I've talked about with various systems, and we can talk about that in future broadcasts, but he does lend a wise counsel to the reality of the Fed and what it would take, what we have to confront to get rid of that private central bank.
Okay, right. Thanks for that, Mark. Well, let's quickly move on. This is an RT article. US B-52 bombed Idlib, Syria, killing over 20 civilians. This is from the Russian Ministry of Defense. The Defense Staff spokesperson said, as we remember, on September 29th last year, the US aviation carried out an attack on Deir ez-Zor, targeting government forces. After this attack, Islamic State started its advance. This latest example is the January 3rd airstrike when a B-52 bomber, without warning, the Russian side hit a target in the town of Sarmada, Idlib province, which is covered by the cessation of hostilities agreement. Over 20 civilians died in the resulting airstrike. They point out the absolute, I'm going to ask you for comment on this in a second, Mark, the absolute insanity of Ash Carter, who basically has said that the Russians have done nothing, absolutely nothing, to defeat ISIS in Syria. They haven't done anything. He said they came in and they said they were going to defeat ISIL, and they said they were going to help in the civil war in Syria. They haven't done either of these things. As a consequence, of course, we're fighting ISIL ourselves. And you've got to wonder whether this man still has all his marbles at this point. But 2 points here. I'll ask Mark for comment on this in a second. But Brian, this seems to be a cleanup operation because, as we pointed out, Idlib is where all the Al-Qaeda and ISIL forces are going now that they're out of eastern Aleppo and so on. They're all being sent to Idlib. They're all being corralled in Idlib. And now they seem to be being bombed in Idlib. And so what's this? The US and the British cleaning up after themselves?
Well, it might well be an attempt at that. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Whatever we think about the people who decided to fight on the, I'll use the rebel words very gently, the terrorist side, of course, the moment they get into an environment where they realise that they were duped, the moment they realise who was really funding them and why, they are going to start talking about what they were really doing, who was supplying the arms, who was supplying the training. So I could imagine that it would be the dead men tell no tales rule. Let's get rid of as many as we can. Maybe the bombing operation was also a rather weak attempt by the US to say, well, actually, we're still a power and we're going to drop a few bombs to try and prove that. I don't know what Mark would...
Well, just before, I was just going to mention that we had heard that special forces had been operating and were in Syria perhaps to achieve the same ends and were refusing to follow those orders?
Well, that's clearly what we heard. What we were told was that British Special Forces were actually refusing to carry out what appeared to be an execution role, get into an area and kill these people and get out. Whoever those individuals were they just civilians? We don't know. But the inference was that these specialist troops were refusing to do that, which is a pretty interesting state of affairs.
So, Mark, what about Ashton Carter? Is he just off his head?
Well, certainly he's one of the most puzzling defense secretaries that we've had, Mike. He seems to be the least rational and the most war-prone, and also a kind of an ironic guy. He's one of the top members of the United States Peace Council, the United States Peace Institute, pardon me. And they're supposedly these acolytes of peace, and they're another think tank in Washington, D.C. Why you'd have the Secretary of Defense on a peace council is a bit of a head scratcher to me. And while this B-52 item is open to interpretation and we don't have all the facts, I think Brian's view is plausible, at least, that this is a broom and a dustpan for the Western powers, particularly the U.S., to clean up these terrorists who just might be talking amongst each other now that the thing that the U.S. and other Western media are very reluctant to report, if they'll report it at all, now that Aleppo has been liberated. This is, of course, continuing to be the huge news. Aleppo has been largely, if not completely, liberated, and the Western press is very reticent to report that, and they probably haven't really fully revealed that, if they've revealed that at all. Eva Bartlett has cleared that up. Vanessa Beeley, another person on the ground there in Aleppo, has cleared that up. These countries have been liberated. Syria, Aleppo has been liberated. It's early here, guys. So that liberation has happened in Aleppo, and Russian forces did, in fact, play a role in that liberation in truly making these terrorists back down, these so-called freedom fighters back down, these resistance leaders, as they're sometimes alternatively called. So more distortion from the press that it takes RT and UK column to clear up.
Yeah.
Well, we just had this one in a report from the Telegraph here in UK. Self-explanatory headline: US warship fires warning shots at Iranian patrol boat. And secondary part of that headline: American Navy is going to experience a big build-up. So the figure they're talking about is 355 ships. This is quite an increase because the current level is 272, and that's going to cost an extra 4.12 billion. I've got $5 billion is the figure a year in a 30-year projection. One of the unions has said, well, can the government actually fund this? So some interesting things going on there with America. We understood was in trouble financially, but apparently not for defence. And I'll just add that, of course, the Telegraph uses this report to ramp up the rhetoric about the nasty Russians and Chinese, although we regard the Chinese as a friend of Britain because the Conservatives have invited them in to replace our nuclear infrastructure. So a little bit of confusion there. Obviously, the Americans don't fully understand how nice the Chinese are, bring them in to rebuild. Mark, we're watching utter madness on the world's scene, wherever you go. Madness on the ground and madness in the way the press are reporting it.
Well, I wanted to mention as a additional point that in the western United States, particularly Utah, which is right here, China has established what can be described as industrial zones or large industrial parks. And so even though we proclaim China to be this intractable foe, China has set up what amounts to Chinese operations or Chinese practical sovereign operations on US soil and established these industrial parks. And this has been happening for 5 or 6 years. And so they not only import Chinese products, they import Chinese workers and Chinese linked, Chinese invested factories. And so, you wonder about all this saber rattling and all this duplicity. But this is another oddity that I reported on in American Free Press some years ago, and I think it's time for a follow-up. So there's a lot of strange happenings going on.
Yeah.
Well, I would think this would be an excellent topic because there's been quite a lot over the internet talking about the presence of Chinese assets on American soil, some of them very loose. You don't get a lot of evidence behind it. You're talking factually about these manufacturing bases or whatever they are. So I think this would be really good to talk about this. Seems to me the public is just kept wrapped up in the possible movement towards war. So the American forces operating off the seaboard of China. Britain's inviting the Chinese in to rebuild the nuclear power stations, that strategic infrastructure. And we've got Chinese assets moving into America. So the public is distracted with fear of war. Meanwhile, the one world order establishes itself under our very noses. Just a final comment, if you will, and we'll end there.
Well, the internationalization of economics and politics necessarily involves not just importing products, but importing people, hence the open borders, but importing entire factories, because they don't recognize any one zone of the world as having any kind of real political, economic, or cultural identity. Everything is integrated, everything is mixed together and thrown in a blender. And this is just more evidence of that. So some of these military things are real, but some of these military things might very well just be a distraction, just a bunch of swill for the public to ponder and of course to create fear. And out of the chaos and fear comes more order. That's why honest news, like we try our best to put out, needs to really keep rising to counter the real fake news from the so-called mainstream media, so these things can be sorted out and the fear factor can actually be reduced. That's what ultimately has to happen.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Mark. And that brings us to the end of today's news. I'll just end by saying, if you're not already a subscriber for UK Column, please consider doing that and or make a donation. We need your financial support to keep doing what we're doing. And as Mark Anderson has just said, it's becoming more and more important that alternative news is pushing out the facts and the truth to counter this widespread propaganda. So it's up to you. If you like what we're doing, please support us with a subscription, which simply takes pressure off us. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.